evening and welcome to the Catalyst, Staffordshire University's brand new £43 million state-of-the-art building. I'm Jenny Amphlett, Network Coordinator for Made in Stoke-on-Trent, and I'll be chairing tonight's International Women's Day panel discussion. International Women's Day is a global celebration of the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. It also marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. This year's theme is Break the Bias, and tonight I'm joined by a panel of key figures from the region and one very young apprentice who are all breaking down bias and stereotypes in different ways. We hope you're going to enjoy a lively conversation, and then there will at the end be time for audience questions. First, some housekeeping. The toilets are located on your left as you leave this room. We aren't expecting a fire alarm this evening, so if you hear one, please leave by one of the fire exits. And this evening's event is being live streamed and will be available for you to view later on YouTube. Now, let's meet the panel. Starting with Sarah at the end there, can you each give a quick 30-second introduction to yourself?
Yeah, good evening. My name's Sarah Robertson. I'm Senior Journalist for Communities at BBC Radio Stoke. I grew up in Stafford. I moved away and came back, and I have a new baby, well, a toddler. I've returned from maternity leave recently, and a lot of my work focuses on kind of giving voices to underserved audiences in Stoke-on-Trent, making sure that we reach out to people and that we're seen to be visible and making a difference in the community in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. I'm honoured to be here today, and it's very important to me to raise the voices of women, but also mothers, but also my stay-at-home partner, who is a stay-at-home dad. So that's a little bit about me, my personal life, and my career.
Good evening, colleagues. I'm Martin Jones. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive of Staffordshire University, but I've been in post since the 1st of January this year. Previously, I was the Deputy Vice-Chancellor since May 17. Can you hear me at the back okay? Stand for lots of things, really. I'm here to represent inclusivity. I'm here to listen as well, us being the only men on the panel. So I'm here to listen to take effect, or to also talk about some of the university's policies as well, but also to make it clear that the university, being the catalyst for change, is a catalyst in change with inclusivity at its core, which is why we are represented here today. Looking forward to interacting with my panellists. So thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, hi, good evening. My name's Jenny Johnston. I'm the People and Culture Manager at a sheet metal manufacturing firm called KMF based in Newcastle-under-Lyme. I've worked for the organisation for 20 years, and during that time I have very passionately brought on our apprenticeship training programme, of which I'm sort of an ambassador for bringing young women into engineering and trying to change the stigma of, like I said, women in engineering. So I'm here to sort of share my experiences based on that. Thank you.
Thanks. So my name is Ravinder, Kaur. I'm the new Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for Staffordshire University. So this is probably my 8th week in the role. But my background has been looking at sort of social mobility and also community cohesion. I think my passion has always been about looking at what makes people thrive, and also what are the actual disadvantages that our young people are actually facing in society, and what can we do to address some of those disparities going forward, whether it's through education, health, or in unemployment, but also looking at what can we do to make a more of an inclusive culture within the organisation that actually embraces the diversity of society going forward.
Thanks. So I'm Meg Baldwin. I captain at Port Vale Women's Football Club, and I am a local high school PE teacher. I moved to Stoke-on-Trent about 8 years ago, following a big sporting background, and I've always been passionate about pushing and helping and ensuring women have got the same opportunities in sport now, because the ones I were the ones I never got when I was a child, you know, wanting to be that woman in sport, and it's all about their physical, their lifelong participation, their physical activity and love for movement.
Okay, so on to our first question of the evening. I'm going to direct this one to you, Meg, because I know you've been talking about something similar with pupils at school today. It's 2022. Do we still need an International Women's Day? And if we do, why?
Yeah, so I've sort of tested my response on some 13-year-old boys today. at school, and they were saying, no miss, we don't, we don't get an International Men's Day. Why do you get a Women's Day? And it was sort of trying to educate them, and I think that is going to be my general feel for tonight. Is about education being key, about being an oppressed gender. Yes, we're not as oppressed as we once were, but the comments of why do you get it and we don't is what needs to be addressed. And we were saying earlier, it's not about women over men, it's about men and women. It's not putting men down, it's not telling them that they're not important. It's about raising awareness and giving women the confidence and the voice to be able to be equal to men.
And Ravinder, I know that you've been looking at some of the reasons why you feel that International Women's Day is needed globally.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the data, we still have a gender pay gap. And I was reading an article where he said it's going to take us 139 years before we address the gender pay gap. This is where men are being paid more than women, because men tend to be in some of those most senior roles where they get higher sort of like wages. So for me, it's about addressing that issue and also making sure that every job role and every pay scale, there is that diversity. I've had very similar sort of questions about, why do we have International Women's Day? And there is actually International Men's Day too. It happens in October, and it deals with very much, men's sort of gender-specific issues. So for me, the rise of women doesn't have to be the fall of men. It's about how can we thrive together and how can we succeed together to make a fairer, more equal society.
And Sarah, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I think the key there for is International Women's Day, and I said to my fellow panellists earlier that I'm speaking from a point of privilege as a white cisgendered woman in the UK, where I've got contacts and colleagues that work for the BBC in our Kabul office, for example, that have evacuated, and a woman there has got a very different experience than me, and if it's not for me, which it still is with the gender pay gap and all the microaggressions we face in the workplace still, but it's not just us here in the UK that need International Women's Day. And actually, I think I feel the responsibilities, I'm sure everybody else does, of using my voice to raise and elevate other women, whether that be in the UK from a less privileged point of view than me, or across the world.
And moving on to our next question, I'm going to direct this one to Martin. Talking about this evening's event on social media, a member of the public commented, "What use is a talk show year on year? There is little change for thousands of women who work for less than £10 per hour across Staffordshire. Where is the funding that gives women a chance to get out of poverty, access education and turn their lives around?"
Great question. The first point I'd make, Jenny, is it's not just women that are kind of disadvantaged in the labour market. I think it's men as well. So the Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent labour market is really interesting in terms of low pay. If you look at the universal credit data, which is the benefit that's in place at the minute, 80% of those on universal credit in some areas are in work. So there's an in-work poverty that's non-gender specific, disadvantages men and disadvantages women as well as if you look at the part-time employment data, there is a gender bias in there in terms of the economy that we're in outside our window here today. Interesting question where the funding is. There's currently a government consultation out at the minute that came out on the 24th of February with a response date the 6th of May, which is going to introduce something called a lifelong loan entitlement. Part of that policy that Staffordshire University will be responding to in a positive way is it's equivalent to 4 years worth of funding. That is a way of re-engaging part-time workers in the labour market in terms of the HE study market. There's been a trend over the last 5 years of taking part-time funding away from higher education. Government recognises the need to engage all genders in education in a variety of ways. What you've seen over the last sort of 12 years, an expansion of 18-year-olds going into higher education, that's male and female, slightly positive female numbers. So if you look at our own Staffordshire University numbers, it's kind of 52 to 48% in favour of women going into higher education. The mature market is slightly different. So there's a consultation out at the minute that's supposed to be introducing flexible study for folk engaging in HE in a series of ways. So I'd be positive about some of the changes. I think we've all got a lot of work to do in terms of challenging some of the assumptions that are out there in the labour market, making sure there's opportunity for everyone. What I stand for at Staffordshire University is an inclusive form of economic and social engagement, which is really important that we maintain this. And it's important, I think, to have events like this in terms of awareness raising. So I'm also in favour of the first question of having an international perspective is really, really important, that we look at this in a global context, that we look at our own data, not just in the context of where we are at a county level, where we look nationally and internationally, because there are some horrible trends out there in the world that we need to focus on. We are all in relatively privileged positions, aren't we? And it's good to look globally. So the word international is really, really important to me in this context, Jenny, as well.
And moving on to gender stereotypes. Are gender stereotypes still preventing women or men from succeeding in certain professions? I'm going to aim this question to you, Jenny. How do we encourage more young girls and women into male-dominated STEM careers, and what are the barriers?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, in terms of the 20 years that I've worked in engineering, one thing I'm very, very keen to do, and we run a school engagement project with high schools across Stoke-on-Trent. Part of that school engagement is that we try and encourage, where possible, that the teams that take part are 50-50, girls and boys, because this is where girls need to have that opportunity to work on a STEM-related project that they otherwise may not be involved in. So organisations like ourselves will work with the schools and they'll run a project, whatever it may be. We build cars, we send things into space, we make clocks. There's a whole different wide range of different opportunities that where us as a business, because we want girls into engineering. I'm a female, you know, it's not 50-50 in our business, it's probably more 80-20, but over time, the girls that are coming through our apprenticeship training programme, they're becoming team leaders, they're still working in the manufacturing, they're becoming welding technicians, for example. In fact, some of our welders the better welders are females, they seem to have a steadier hand. And that's the kind of message that I'm trying to get out to schools, is that engineering might be still seen, and even for boys, it's still seen as a potential dirty job. Well, actually, come and visit, and we have a lot of visits at KMF, we have lots of tours, we have lots of work experience opportunities, and this is where we want other businesses, particularly in engineering and manufacturing, to open their doors to young people, to get them to come and actually spend that time. As I said, do the work experience programmes in year 10, 11, 12, whichever, and have a go and actually see what the opportunities are out there, and actually try and change the stigma of what engineering actually is, and particularly apprenticeships as well. So I'm quite a keen ambassador for apprenticeships in all different industries, not just our own. And part of that, we have a network of employers who go out to schools. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of change the mindset of teachers and parents, because, you know, any young person who wants to, you know, what am I going to do in my career? Where shall I go next? The first person they speak to is their teacher, potentially, before they even speak to their parents. So we're trying to change that mindset of the teachers before, obviously, then hopefully changing the mindset of parents.
And moving on to Meg, are changing attitudes making it easier for women to pursue careers in sports like football?
Yeah, I think so. And just listening to Jenny, it sounds like sport has possibly been propelled forwards ahead of STEM and engineering. And I think events like the 2019 Women's World Cup has really, like I said, you know, it was the catalyst of it. You know, from there, it's been almost a complete explosion of exposure, and it has helped with getting women into sport. And it's not just performing, it's working, and there are women, you know, on the front, you know, in sport that are leading it. So women like Laura Woods, she's a pundit in football, and she does darts, she does boxing, and you see her everywhere. And she made a comment not long ago about, you know, she had some really bad comments made towards her on Twitter, and she had said something like, you know, women are allowed to perform brain surgery, they're allowed to go to the moon, but they're not allowed to have an opinion on football. As soon as they're given that platform to do things like that, they get laughed off on social media. And I think that's really, really important that, you know, women like Laura are doing things like that. And Alex Scott used to play football for Arsenal and for England, and there's initiatives out there, one called #HerGameToo, which has been really important for pushing women in sport and, you know, letting them have their voice and be able to showcase their abilities It shouldn't be a case of, can a woman have a job to tick a diversity box? It's, can a woman have a job because she is the best in her field?
And Ravinder, are there challenges here that go beyond gender?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at sort of like the diversity issue, so if you've got a disability or you come from a different sexuality or you come from, you know, a sort of ethnic minority background, there are those different challenges. So at times there can be double discrimination. So there's like, you know, if you do have a disability, there's always a challenge of whether you're going to be employed and also whether you're going to be employed within a senior role. And I think what we need is more role models where, you know, people are sort of like openly discussing their sexuality or openly discussing their disability, but also making sure that we do have that diverse range of people sitting within the boards and the committees where those decisions are being made, and also within the C-suite roles. So with that diverse thinking, we can start changing the actual policies and the plans and the systems in the organisation to actually make that actual culture a bit more inclusive. But also, I think as parents, what we need to also look at is what are we encouraging our children to go into, right from the toys we give them to play. You know, if we're giving all the boys the cars and the trains and giving all the girls dolls, you know, you already are setting those biases at a very, very young age. So it's about us being a bit more sort of like gender fluid and gender neutral and encouraging sort of like that diversity from very, very young age.
And moving on to equal pay, conversations and campaigns around equal pay have been taking place for decades. But going this one at you, Sarah, why is this still an issue? And what's your experience been at the BBC with this?
I think there's obviously high-profile cases for Carrie Gracie and Samira Ahmed at the BBC that way back in 2018, and there's obviously BBC was investigated by the Equality and the Human Rights Commission, and obviously wasn't found to have crossed any lines legally, but what it has taught, I guess, senior management at the BBC, I'm talking for them here when obviously I'm not in that role, is that, you know, they were suggested that we need more transparency, that we need more honest conversations about pay. And although I'm not paid anywhere near Carrie Gracie or Samira Ahmed's, you know, in the top earners at the BBC, which is over £150,000 a year, it inspired me to have conversations I hadn't had before. So I did, after the high-profile equal pay cases came out, went up to a male colleague at Radio Stoke and I just said, this is going to be difficult, but how much do you earn? I want to know if it's the same as me. And I did in my head think, gosh, what am I going to do if I earn more than him here when I'm going in with the kind of like thinking I'm going to be earning less. And actually we're exactly the same. It was someone that's in an equitable job. So, you know, we did the similar role and we've been at the BBC the same amount of time. And we were paid equally, and I asked a fellow manager now, who was obviously a line manager at the time, and he said, you know, we are really conscious of that at Radio Stoke, that we do look at the pay and make sure that people are paid fairly and equally, which, you know, what could I ask for more in my role? But there's a lot to be learned. You know, I was looking at the gender pay gap data, the latest data, before we came here today, and I suppose in our company, in the BBC, on average, women get paid 6% less than men. Some of that is the men are still occupying the higher paid jobs, and you know, and senior leadership. I think it's 44% of women, senior leaders are women at the BBC at the moment, which I think is pretty good. We're getting there. There's progress to be made, but in terms of equal pay, I think as long as we learn from, you know, from the high-profile cases and filter that down, which it seems to be happening, and I can't talk for other companies, but inside the BBC. But sometimes it's not about pay, it's about, you said, about representation. I mean, if you look at the coverage of the Ukraine at the moment and the conflict, you know, Lise Doucet and Orla and Sarah Rainsford, they are on the front line, they're women. And for me as a girl, if I'd seen that, and I sort of did with K80, I would have been more inspired and more confident to go into the job I went into. So yeah, pay is important, but also representation in any industry, I feel.
And I'm going to move this one on to you, Martin, if that's okay. What is the responsibility for employers regarding equal pay?
Well, we publish every year the EDI annual report, so you're right. I mean, gender pay gap data is something that concerns me. The sector average for our education is 16%, but Staffordshire University fares better at 9%, and 9% is still not good enough, of course. That's 9%, so our workforce is 56% female, 43 male. What's interesting, our student body, I know we have Hannah in the audience from the Student Union, the president, is 52%, 47. What's interesting when you look at the data, so it's 9% compared to a sector average of 16, is that the data shows that our gender pay gap, I think, is a result of having more women in roles at lower grades in the pay structure than men. So in a sense, it's you need to look at the grades as well. What's interesting is that both men and women appear in the same pay grade. We know that they are paid equally because we've done the pay audits. But in a sense, we still need to narrow that gap from 9%. So, but interesting when you look at the median rather than the mean. So if the average is 9%, when you look at the median itself, i.e. the distribution at Staffordshire University, it's 0, which is, I think, good in terms of comparative sector data, which is very positive compared to 14% for the sector. What we're doing at Staffordshire University, of course, is really important to take things forward. So we acknowledge that 9% is still a gap that we want to shrink. We want a fresh approach to the attraction and recruitment of staff in roles. So there's a big role in terms of how you advertise. Often it's the language that you use in adverts and the way you present yourself. I mean, we're in a market, aren't we? Market competitiveness and all those neoliberal words, you know, kind of come across as very masculine. So I'm aware of the kind of the languages and the tones that we use in our recruitment processes, but also training on appointment panels as well. It's really, really important. Often you have unconscious bias, don't you, in terms of the ways that you recruit. You don't mean to. It's just the gender norms that are inbuilt. But also, you know, performance data and review processes, by the fact they are performance-based, and the use of KPIs can present you in a particular way that I'm conscious of. But also, you know, champion role models. I wouldn't be here today had I not worked for an inspirational female who was a VC, who gave me confidence when I worked in a very kind of female strong team and an executive. So certainly I've worked for more female vice-chancellors than male vice-chancellors in my career, 3. So, you know, proactive role models are really, really important. But also championing sector-wide initiatives in terms of the Aurora Women's Personal and Professional Development Programme. Participating in, you know, Athena Swan and other initiatives where we can do is really, really important. So in my role, I try to make sure that, you know, we champion national initiatives and involved in that. But also at Staffordshire University, we've got a new EDI delivery plan as well. So it's a purpose-built HROD strategy that aligns with our vision and our values. And our vision and values have been the catalyst for change as an inclusive employer. So although we are 9%, you know, difference, which is, you know, it's below the sector, I'm not proud of that 9%. It should be 0 on all indicators, shouldn't it?
Let's move this one over to you, Meg. What's the gender pay gap in sport? There isn't much of one, is there?
So in sport, they say that it is worse in sport than it is in politics, business and medicine. There was a report a few years back where 88% of women in the Women's Super League, which is the highest you can go playing-wise, 88% of those women were being paid less than £18,000 a year, which is, you know, less than a sort of a national average household income, compared to male counterparts in their highest grade at 2.6 million. Although I am obviously here for women, okay, I do think that that is relative. Okay, if you're playing for Chelsea men compared to Chelsea women, it has been a gap over decades. And women's football and women in sport, mainly football, you know, we're the ones sort of a little bit more behind than other sports. That gap is a little bit bigger. But obviously, like I mentioned earlier about the 2019 Women's World Cup, it has propelled women's sport forward. There is still a gap, and the gap is narrowing, and it is narrowing slowly. Like Ravinder said earlier, it's going to take 140 years to bridge those sort of gaps. But in sport, like I said, it is relative. If women were bringing in the same attendance and fans to their football matches and having the same exposure that men got, that pay gap would get smaller and smaller. But it's not about whether we are as good as men at football or whether it's as an interesting game or however, you know, you enjoy your sport. It's about being given that exposure on those mainstream TVs, radio, social media, and being given those commercial opportunities that the men do get. You know, the Arnold Clark Cup that England women won a couple of weeks ago, I was at the final, and this is a final international women's match, and there was 13,000 people in attendance. So an international cup final, 13,000. Now it sounds like a lot, but you're talking at men's international finals, you're getting 40,000. Okay, so I went to a game with my dad in probably about 2009, England women against France women down in Exeter, and there was 1,000 in attendance. So the growth has been massive, but we're still behind in acceptance and in status as we are to our male counterparts. But like I said, it is getting better. West Brom played Derby County on the weekend just gone, and it was at the Hawthorns. And this is where the male teams, Port Vale for myself, West Brom, Exeter, Plymouth, Derby, have to be involved where they are giving the women the same facilities as they are giving the men. Manchester United women, only a couple of years ago, they made big complaints that their training pitch was so far away from any form of facilities, they had to take a 10 to 15 minute walk just to go to the toilet. But the men's was there, it was available, but we don't seem to get that we are a second thought because we are women.
Okay, let's move this on to the impact of the pandemic. Ravinder, I'm going to aim this one at you. What have been the benefits and the disadvantages of remote working for women during the pandemic?
I think for me, if you look at the way sort of it panned out, before the actual pandemic, we had less agile and remote working, and suddenly overnight we had to switch to sort of like home working. Though for majority of sort of people with caring duties, that was absolutely brilliant. However, it sort of also put that added layer of pressures where you had to still continue homeschooling, and you still had to continue sort of like, a full-time role. So for us, it was about making sure we had those agile and fair work practices in place, and looking at, what could be the challenges. We've also got to remember that, at times when we talk about domestic violence and abuse, women suffer more from, abuse, and where they may have sort of like left their home to come into a job to get away from the abuse, suddenly they were in a locked environment. So we had to make sure that we had the proper sort of like policies and procedures in place where we were taking care of our employees while they were home working. So there were definitely advantages and disadvantages, but I think going forward it's about looking at, what's causing sort of that gender pay gap, especially for women that may have caring duties, women that perhaps are not only looking after young children, but also sort of elderly parents and also people that have got a disability. What can we make sure that where our policies and our processes and our procedures are actually fair and inclusive? So we're creating that culture of sort of like, empowerment, but also where we are actually more of a caring organisation.
I'm moving that on to you, Jenny. Was it possible to work from home in a career like engineering?
In a nutshell, no. In terms of our particular business, when the pandemic hit, obviously our business was massively impacted, like most businesses across the world. We wouldn't have been able to survive without the government job support scheme, where we did have to furlough a good percentage of our employees, but they weren't selected based on gender, it was purely based on our production needs. So a whole mix of different roles, and men and women were having to obviously stay at home. However, what we did do is once we'd because everybody was probably in the same boat, 24th of March 2020, we all had the assumption, or were told, that we were going into lockdown for 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, or should I say 2.5 weeks later, no, we're going to extend it for another 3 weeks, and then we'll extend it for another 3 weeks. So nobody had any, we'd never have a crystal ball anyway, but nobody could envisage that this 3-week lockdown would continue into essentially almost 2 years of nobody really knows what's happening from one day to the next. So very much as we've heard in terms of our own policies, our own procedures, we had to very quickly adapt to what our employees needed. So for those that we did actually put, after we sort of got through that first 3 weeks, and I think it became quite obvious that lockdown 1, lockdown 2, lockdown 3, we needed to be able to support our employees as best as possible. So in manufacturing, we are key workers. The government allowed us to have that facility as a key worker, so members of staff who, where the schools were opened and they were, you know, children could go to the schools as key worker children. My son was a key worker kid. To be fair, the first lockdown, I think he quite enjoyed going to school because it wasn't educational. It was very much a go and have some fun. But on the same token, it was good that he did still go, because as we've heard, and I think a lot of children have suffered massively. My daughter was the first year group to not have her GCSE results. She didn't sit at GCSEs, and I think the social element that our children have suffered over this last 2 years is still going to be around, and we'll still have to support them through it. You know, as much as we're sort of here talking about women, and we're talking about the women that, you know, parents that have had to homeschool and try and support, we've also got to consider our children, our, you know, young girls and young boys in terms of where they're going to be over this next sort of 5 years, because it's going to take that length of time, if not more potentially, to change their ways in terms of their abilities to interact.
I'm going to send this one back over to you, Sarah. So thinking about the way things will move forward and the move to more permanent online working, will that lack of face-to-face mentoring hinder young women as they begin their careers, do you think?
I was just thinking about that mentoring and kind of the progression in careers with lockdown. I mean, I spent lockdown on maternity leave because I had a baby just before the pandemic, and I came into this whole new world where I felt like I was starting again, really, and everything had changed about the way we worked. But in terms of it benefiting me, I think it did. I was always, I've always been outspoken, but kind of in meetings, that space, even I found it easier on Zoom when I got back. I mean, I'd spent obviously maternity leave doing baby sensory on Zoom, so I was very au fait with it. I came back into a professional environment and did it, and I spoke up probably more than I would have done, or I pulled someone up on something I didn't like, whereas if I was in a meeting, I might not have said that. I found it easier to balance doing interviews with people because I didn't have to travel to loads of places, and I live in Stafford, and the commute. And I think that going into industries, just talking again internally with the BBC, there's a lot more agile working. I'm an agile worker. I do 4 weeks in Stafford from my home office and 1 day a week from the studios in Hanley. And I think if I was starting now, yes, there's more opportunities open to me because I can look through the BBC Careers Hub and think, I don't need to live in London to do this job anymore, whereas at the start of my career, I would have had to move to London. And now you don't have to necessarily, because you can work for the World Service and live in Stoke-on-Trent, you know, and that's beneficial. In terms of mentoring, I guess, again, access to mentors. I could mentor somebody somewhere else in the country at a different local radio station, and that young woman I'm in the Global Women in News Network at the BBC, and my mentor was in Liverpool, and I used to have to travel up and take time out of my working day to go and see her. So actually, I think the opportunity to have those access to those people and their experience is greater. You're not going to have your water cooler moments. You're not going to be able to kind of bump into somebody and have those elevator pitches or whatever. I mean, I was never into that anyway. So I suppose actually the people like myself that might not put themselves forward like that are more likely to now with the idea of agile working. And it's easier to juggle it a little bit more, I think.
And Martin, is there anything you'd like to add into that?
Yes, I mean, it's flexibility for some rather than others. I think we've got to be careful generalising. You know, some people, you know, have been trapped in certain situations. I think, as Ravinder claims, you know, the stability of the household unit is really, really important. You know, accessibility to childcare. Certainly, we have a location-based policy at the university that recognises that flexibility and the need, flexibility to work in different environments. You know, I'm here with Jocelyn today because my partner also is involved in a university. She's also on a university executive. I could, of course, had an argument, a conversation saying, you know, I'm a Vice-Chancellor, I'm more important to you, than you. You can have the sun this evening, Jocelyn. I wouldn't do that because I'd probably end up with a P45 followed by a P60. But also, you know, Victoria, my partner, is also on a university executive. You know, so, you know, I couldn't have that argument. It's not an argument that I would have before or after or during lockdown. I mean, certainly the availability for childcare is really, really important. You know, so certainly homeschooling, I think, impacted in a really interesting gendered way in terms of lockdown one. You know, if you look at some of the data on that, you know, the predominance of, you know, I think women doing more of the childcare at home, you know, it fell in particular ways, and you saw the data shifting through, I think, the other lockdowns. But in a sense, I think we've learned as an employer on the importance of blended delivery, and blended delivery not just learning and teaching, but its importance in terms of bringing into play a location-specific working policy. Fine line between that and, of course, in terms of the difference between being present and presenteeism. In terms of presenteeism being a method of control, you're trying to control him at the minute. So I think blended working policies are predicated on trust, and it's really, really important because trust is a way of addressing gender divisions, of course. So I'm certainly in favour of it. I've personally benefited, of course, because of course my son arrived on the 6th of September during lockdown. So in a sense, those kind of walking moments in terms of being away from work benefited certainly my family bonding unit. But what was interesting is that Jocelyn, of course, only ever saw people in masks. So he learnt, the sparkle in people's eyes. He didn't know what a smiley face was, in terms of people smiling at him under a mask. So in a sense, lots of people like him, in terms of when they came back 6 months ago, he didn't know what a smiley face was. Only ever saw people in a mask, and the mask was the norm. So some of those characteristics of how people grow up and how they develop would be really interesting to watch, whether it's positive or negative in terms of some hyper-digital mode of being or whatever. But it's certainly been an experience. But I am in a privileged position of having access to childcare. Lots of people aren't in that position where their family lives can become very, very complex, almost being trapped in the context of what is flexibility for some is not flexibility for others. So I think we've got to be careful generalising. But certainly responding as employees to that is really proactive in terms of trust, in terms of how you do things.
Now let's move this on to the image of feminism. I'm going to throw this one over to you, Meg. How has the image of feminism changed in recent years, do you think?
I think specifically in sport, feminism is something that is definitely more prominent, and I think with sports women, we still face a lot of sexism on a day-to-day basis. I can be scrolling through my Twitter and I'll see, again, people like Laura Woods or Alex Scott or women in general that I follow on Twitter that do face a lot of sexism, and I think feminism is what we can use to tackle sexism and achieve that sort of level playing field, pun intended. And I think that with initiatives like the Her Game too, I spoke to a co-founder of the initiative yesterday just to sort of get a bit more insight into what they do. And she said about the personal growth that they've had over the last 10 months, and they've only been going that long, where they produced a video of the holding up signs of the things that get said to them often at football, things like, you belong in the kitchen, do you even know what the offside rule is, etc., etc. And when I spoke to her, she said about how many national teams that have bought into the initiative and the professional relationships that they've got with clubs from the Premier League down to sort of lower league teams, Port Vale included. There's been new systems put in place for reporting sexism in and around football. There is the presence of the Her Game 2 initiative as well, which just encourages and reminds men and women that there is a place for women in sport. There's dedicated fixtures where the men, who are streamed to millions of people, they're watching these games and they're wearing the Her Game 2 tops, just raising that a little bit of awareness. And when I spoke to her, she said that they realise that even with all of this, they're in partnership with hundreds of clubs now, they still have only scratched the surface with attacking sexism with feminism.
Now I'm going to send this back over to you, Sarah. Is a fear of cancel culture and feminist shaming preventing people from speaking out? I know you have a personal experience that you're happy to share with us.
Yeah, so I got told I was too feminist in the office in the official complaints box. A friend of mine had brought some vulva cupcakes in and we were talking about it. She worked for a sex education charity as well as working for the company. And somebody said to me, I think a guy, anyway, the conversation carried on and someone went, well, what's the patriarchy anyway? Why do I need to know? And he was a young, probably early 20s journalist. And I lost it with him a little bit. Because he said, well, I don't need to know, I'm a man. And I explained exactly why he'd need to know. I won't go into the conversation. You can imagine the words were quite strong. And then the conversations that happened subsequently were around the fact that, oh, well, we can't say anything anymore because, we've got feminists over there and her over there. And I just remember sitting there thinking, you can still laugh, you can still joke, but if I think you're being inappropriate, I will tell you. And I'm not saying you can't have a laugh, but not at the expense of me and my belief system and what I'm fighting for and what my mum fought for and what my grandmother fought for. And I just think if there's attitude like that in kind of young men in their early 20s that don't even know what the word patriarchy means, then that's why we've still got International Women's Day, if we're going back to square one. But yeah, in an office to be told that I'm too feminist for mentioning the word vulva and talking about my rights and no, you can't say that about the date you've just been on because it's inappropriate, then I think there's a place for feminism. And I think it's done 360 because as a teenager growing up, my mum came out when I was 13, and I remember at school really associating kind of being a lesbian and feminism, and I was like really ashamed that I felt like I was a feminist and I had to like out myself at university. And if I think back now, it seems completely crazy to me that I thought like that, but it was so true. Like I just had this link that it was like these dirty words as a teenager, but I believed everything that I was being kind of raised on, I guess. So it's come away from that for me on my personal journey. But again, I kind of went home the day that on the event that happened and just thought, what? Am I in the wrong? And I remember driving back down the M6 thinking, should I have said that in the office? I was thinking, no, he should be thinking, should I said that in the office, really? And I think that's my personal experience of it. And I think that the changing face of it, there's a long way to go for people not to throw I'm a woke feminist as an insult. Because actually, I'm like, well, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you. Can I send this back over to you, Ravinder? What do you think are the differences between feminism and equality?
I think it comes from history and also, I suppose, a negative press that feminism has had, while I think if you look at equalities, that seems to be a little bit more all-embracing. And I think, the two actually are quite blurred. So for me, I'd like to say that, yes, I'm a feminist because I believe in promoting equalities for everyone. But if that means that, okay, I'm just promoting equalities for women, because there is that disparity within sort of like women careers or sort of women sort of like getting their fair share of even sort of any benefits across sort of like, society, then that suddenly makes you sort of like, are you anti-men? And I think we need to sort of separate the two. And it's for me, I think with being a feminist, it's just you're just championing the cause for women, and for some reason, it's just become that very negative word that if you're feminist, you're suddenly anti-men. And I think for us, it's just about making sure that whenever there is banter, it's about when that banter becomes an appropriate banter, and also where banter sort of then can lead to sort of like, how shall I say, a little bit of discrimination. It may start off as banter, somebody may say as a joke, but for me, when we talk about biases, I always say it's not about somebody being unconsciously biased. It's about how can we be consciously inclusive. That conversation, was that being consciously inclusive to someone? Because people need to think, what am I doing and how am I behaving and what impact will that have on someone?
Thank you. Shall we throw questions open to the audience? I think we have a microphone that can rove around. Anyone like to ask anything from our panel this evening? The lady there in the green jumper.
Thank you very much. Oh, can you hear me?
I don't know if it's switched on. Do we need to?
It is switched on. Okay. Thank you very much, panel. My question is for Meg Baldwin. You talked about the lack of audience in women's football. Actually, it's the same, I think, in cricket or rugby. But when you look at women's sports like basketball, we do see a big audience. Or if it's individual sports like the Wimbledon singles finals or the men's singles finals, you see the same amount of audience. Why do you think there is this disparity in different forms of women's sports?
I think it's mainly because of, sort of when it was started, how it was started, how sports are seen. So I think with football, rugby, basketball, they are still very much viewed as a masculine sport. You run like a girl, for example, if you're playing football or you're watching boys play football, those sorts of pejorative statements are still thrown out there. Man up, you run like a girl, throw like a girl, etc. Women in football, specifically obviously that being my sort of specialty and my specialism, there was a point around 1939 where women's football started, but it was stopped by the FA because of, they didn't want women to take football away from men. And I think that's sort of where it is at. It's just completely dependent on the sport and how it is viewed. Netball, when I was at school, and I left in 2008, so not even really that long ago, PE was very much netball, hockey, gymnastics, dance, badminton possibly, whereas boys got to do the football, the rugby and those masculine sports. I don't think I ever played basketball. And as much as I say there's been progression in sport, as a high school teacher, I teach PE in a local high school, and when I came into that, it was still very much the same. It was still very much, there was only enough netballs for the girls' PE. There was only enough football for the boys' PE. Basketball still wasn't on the girls', it's on our curriculum, but you can choose what's on your curriculum. As long as you're covering your invasion games or you're covering your outwitting opponents and your net and wall, it's the opportunities that are given to us that stops that ability of playing. So again, when you mentioned cricket, although we are able to teach cricket in girls' PE, we do rounders because that is what the girls do. The boys, they do cricket. And it's about changing that as well as, changing it at school level. And like we said earlier about doing it at a younger age, if you have a young son, would you naturally put them into a football club when they're ready to coordinate? If you have a daughter, would you put them straight into dance? Or would you give them the opportunity, buy them a ball at 3 or 4? I didn't start playing until I was 11 because that opportunity wasn't available to me.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Oh, Sally, I know your name.
Hi there. My question is to Jenny Johnson. So I worked in human resources in engineering for 12 years. 2.5 years ago, I got diagnosed as autistic. And when I got diagnosed, I kind of went to my company and started insisting on my reasonable adjustments. And being engineering, I thought that this would be fine because, as you probably know, engineering is hugely autistic. A lot of autistic men. That didn't really work, and I got basically ousted from the company, and that's all I can say about that because I got a nice silence slapped on me. So I since have gone on and thought, my male boss and all the men that did that are not going to beat me, and went on and opened my own company. So it kind of worked out all right, but. I guess I'm still personally interested, and I've become quite involved with a lot of work around how females are treated with regards to autism. So for years it was thought it was just men or boys that were autistic, and now it's discovered that actually it's not at all.
So, Sally, sorry to interrupt. Do you have a question that you'd like Jenny
to
answer?
Sorry. Yeah, it was just how men are treated fine when they're autistic, like in engineering companies. And I guess my question is, how could you see the future of, females who are autistic being, given that respect that men are?
To be perfectly honest, since I've, in my role at KMF, so I've sort of taken over HR more officially, probably in the last 18 months. And to be perfectly honest, I think within our business particularly, and I've seen it over the 20 years anyway, it doesn't matter what gender you are, we treat everybody as equals. So, all the young people that have come through our business, doesn't matter what age they are. I know you've mentioned about autism, but mental health is quite a hot topic, shall we say. And we're seeing, almost like a flip side of that, where there are a lot more men struggling with mental health. And that's something else that we are managing, and I believe we're managing really well. So it doesn't matter if you are male or female, it really doesn't matter what additional support that people may need. And again, in engineering, I think you were hinting at this earlier in terms of if somebody is struggling with a particular task that they are employed to do, then we work with that person because we do have a duty of care. Every employer has a duty of care to their employees, regardless of what additional requirements, additional support, whatever it may be that they need. And anybody in HR nowadays will recognise that, and they can support their employees because essentially, as I said, we have that duty to people, regardless of what their makeup is.
Now, the chap at the back in the white long-sleeve top, I know you had your hand up. Sorry, Chris.
Sorry, I've got a really croaky throat because I had a sausage roll-related snack accident earlier. So I've come from a computer science department. Computer science has a massive gender disparity. I'm now head of a games department. This is my first role as a line manager of a serious-sized department. And again, fairly big gender disparity. The games industry is that way, unfortunately. As somebody who wants to promote and positive role models of women, something I struggle with is doing that in a way that doesn't kind of invoke tokenism and doesn't make my female colleagues always being lumbered with the same outreach kind of roles that when they may want to direct their career in other, research or different ways. And again, when you've only got a small number of female colleagues and a large number of male colleagues, it's easier to distribute that kind of work. But if you distribute that fairly, it has a higher impact on one side than the other. So I'm just curious, how would you suggest somebody in my position approaches that, and how can I further develop and further recruit women into my department?
Who would you like to send or is there anyone in particular that would like to answer that?
Anybody, really.
Chris, if I can have a go, you're right. I mean, there is a gender bias in your discipline area. It's quite stark, isn't it? I think all we can do is use profiles of, there's a danger not to fall into box-ticking exercise, use profiles of a range of experiences, a range of examples of women working successfully around teaching, research, leadership, administration. But it's tricky when that data is so stark. I mean, it's virtually 60-40, 70-30, isn't it, across the board? But some of the industry success stories aren't they? So it's positive identification of the routes that you can go down and the success stories, using a diversity of different, how gender cuts across race and diversity as well. So it doesn't look like tokenism, but it's an obvious trap to fall into. You often find in higher education, don't you, that you give the same jobs to the same people over and over again. So, making sure that you don't overload people in a number of contexts, but just identifying positive role profiles and role models. And also, I think we have a job to do in HE. We can do this through our schools networks of intervening a lot earlier in the pipeline. So the way we promote, in your case, promote computing and digital literacy and pedagogy in schools, working with Claire in the audience from the sixth form college as well, promoting that. So going down into schools. Staffordshire University, of course, we have 21 schools as part of our multi-academy trust. They are our sponsored schools. We can work with those academised schools to promote gender equality, so to intervene before being stereotyped in a certain way. So I think we have a responsibility to work with our pipeline in a gender-specific way. But it's a great question, Chris.
Now let's take our last question of the evening. Anyone else like to, the lady on stage?
Just thinking about younger people, when, most of the panel have mentioned about disparities with male, female, and thank you. And I'm going to give the example that my daughter went into Brownies at the age of 7. And my husband at the time was a scout leader. And she ended up in Scouts, and she was very fortunate to have that opportunity because her father was in Scouting, and actually another lady had offered to help out. Otherwise that would have been difficult for my husband to have had her, and as it turned out 3 other girls who'd actually asked if they could join Scouting, because Brownies wasn't for them. They were expected to colour in, knit, make cushions to sit on. And actually, they didn't want to do those things. They wanted to map read. They wanted to go outward bounds. They wanted to gain skills. They wanted to get on greasy poles and fall into water. Horrific, but there you go. And none of them saw that opportunity until my husband gave it to them. Now, we have seen other girls within scouting, and actually the female leader has stayed within our area, so I know there are still girls. But actually, we can have girls in scouting, but what I didn't realise was that you don't have boys in brownies. So there are boys that like to knit and colour in and make cakes. I'm doing it now, aren't I? I'm doing exactly what I've just said, you know. I'm putting that gender thing in.
Did you want to ask
Yeah, I do. How can we change this? Because you said, Jenny, we're going into schools and we're promoting engineering. But actually, we're doing that at high schools, but even at primary schools, aren't we? Ravinder, you can hear that, you know, Meg, you're the same in school. Sarah, I can see, you know, you're nodding. And Martin again. What are we going to do to change this mindset? I'm the parent. I put my daughter in brownies and I put my son in scouts. So what are we going to do?
I think looking at that, you know, it's right from the onset. I think as sort of like parents, as sort of like role models, it's the behaviours that we ingrain right from a very, very young age, and that's where it needs to be addressed. And also, I think wherever we hear those gender stereotypes that you can't do this because you're a girl, or you can't do this because you're a boy, it's about that challenge. And, you know, there is that occupational segregation that happens even in households. And I mean, growing up in an Asian culture, though, you know, the men in my culture were quite okay, they could cook a chicken curry, but they weren't allowed to pick up the dishes from the table. So it's this gender stereotypes that are ingrained in some of the cultures that we need to actually beat. And I think the more we speak up, the more we challenge as to, you know, why is it that I can't become, you know, it was quite funny because I think one of my nephews wanted a kitchen for Christmas, and his dad was quite adamant. Why do you want a kitchen for? You know, that's not very gender specific. But it's about looking at Jamie Oliver. You know, he's one of the, you know, the best chefs out there. So sometimes it's our thinking that we need to change to make it a little bit more inclusive.
I think on that I completely agree. Like we talked about sport. My son is 2. He goes to ballet and gymnastics. He's not going near a football if I can help it. He can choose that when he's older. But sorry, Meg. You know, and I got so much criticism from grandparents and my own parents that, you know, well, why are you putting in ballet? Why is he doing ballet? And we got a kitchen, and my partner's nan actually said, I've been thinking about you buying him a kitchen, and men live in houses with kitchens too, so I'm sure that's okay. And I'm like, she's 86, so I was like, great, that's progress, right? But he's the only boy in his ballet class, and actually they're doing a project at the moment, but they came out with these wings, and all the girls had got pink ballerina wings, and the teacher had given him a pair of black wings. And I was thinking, well, that's really cute that she's thought of him, but why can't he just have the same as all the other girls? And, you know, it's stuff like that. So in that kind of arena. But we've tried to, like, I'm full-time at work, my partner is a stay-at-home dad. And talking to him about this, you know, he goes to the park and the mums don't really talk to him. And when I go to the pharmacy, I'm not married, and I get asked, you know, what my relationship is to my son. I'm like, well, he's mom, that's why I'm here. But they will have a conversation with me, and he says, when I go, they treat me differently as a dad that's a stay-at-home dad, that is the primary caregiver, if you want to say that. And I think there is progress to be made. I've tried myself as a mother to kind of balance that, but also be a living inspiration for him, I hope, by being the one that's at work and working full-time and earning the most money. So yes, it starts really early. In my industry, again, we go into schools like yourself and BBC Young Report, and I said at the very beginning kind of about visibility of women in roles at the BBC, whether that's in war zones or whether that's on the executive boards or whether it's at Radio Stoke. And I think there's a project at the moment called 100 Voices, where women and men go into schools and talk about their career paths and what they've done. And, you know, to be, again, a young girl that had been, you know, I sent my work experience to Topshop, and I was like, I want to be a journalist or a spy, and I don't know how that's relevant. And it was just the one where I had to go to a retail. And it was just that assumption that I could do that as work experience. But, yeah, very young, I agree. And I've tried to start from birth. But, yeah.
I'm glad you're challenging the assumptions around gender, because if you look at the history of Baden-Powell and the way that it was called the Boy Scouts and the Boys Brigade as well, it was a way of reinforcing gender stereotyping from the 1940s onwards. I can remember when I was in the Cubs winning a badge called Home Help. was a home help badge, and I got the mickey taken out of me at school, not by you, Maria, at the time. It was by other people we were at school with, because I had this badge, this home help badge, and because it had gendered connotations on it, I got the mickey taken out of me. What I had to do cleaning and cooking, and that was deemed to be not a masculine thing, and it was in the Cubs where all the badges were about making huts and dens and fighting people and that kind of stuff. So, if you look at the history of those movements, they reinforce certain stereotypes. The fact you challenge them by flipping the gender the other round is to be congratulated. In terms of that, why should it be that way? But these are the inbuilt norms in society that reproduce those divisions over time. So I think they're there to be challenged. But it goes back to the fabric of British society and the fabric of capitalism, how patriarchy is inbuilt in terms of a division of labour that needs to be challenged.
Well, thank you, Martin. I think that draws our discussion to a close. Thank you, everyone, for coming along this evening. Hope we're sending you home with food for thought, and that you're going to be back in this building very soon for more community events. Please put your hands together for this evening's panel.